Good afternoon to everybody. Welcome all of you to the webinar Autonomies, Minority Protection and Migration. I'm Roberta Medda-Windischer, Senior Researcher at the Institute for Minority Rights at Eurac Research. I have the pleasure to moderate the discussion of today's webinar. Our focus today is to discuss how, to what extent, and in which aspects autonomous regimes have impacted and still impact on the relationship between historical long-standing communities, the so-called all minorities, and the new communities stemming from more recent migration flows, the so-called new minorities, and whether policies that accommodate long-standing groups and migrants are allies or foes in the pursuit of a cohesive and inclusive society. We will discuss these issues with three distinguished panelists. Let me introduce them to you. We have Johanne Poirier, who teaches constitutional law at McGill's University, Montreal, Canada, and where she also holds the Peter MacKell Chair in Federalism. Before embarking on her academic career, Johanne clerked for the Supreme Court of Canada and worked as a lawyer for the Department of Justice. Her research mainly deals with various aspects of federalism, particularly intergovernmental relations and agreements, as well as the protection of linguistic and national minorities. Recent work explores informal constitutional change in federal systems, as well as the intersection between federalism and human rights protection. We have then Vicent Climent-Ferrando, who is researcher coordinator of the UNESCO Chair on Language Policies for Multilingualism at University Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. Vicent has served as an external policy expert for the European Commission's Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund. And for several years, he has been Network Outreach Manager for the European Network on Linguistic Diversity, NPLD, in Brussels. He has been involved in a number of European projects focusing on mobility and inclusion of migrants in Europe. And his main research interest focuses on policies, politics, and discourses on migrant integration through language, and on nationalism, multilingualism, and identity politics. And then we have Gareth Mulvey. He's a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Glasgow. He primarily researches and teaches around issues of migration, migration policy, and the impact of policy on diverse migrant communities. Prior to working in academia, Gareth was a researcher for over 15 years in the voluntary sector, looking at the experiences of refugees in Scotland. Gareth has published on issues related to identity in Scotland, the relationship between central immigration policy and evolved immigrant policy in Scotland, and also on the role of migrants and minorities in the Scottish referendum. Our discussion today will last until 6:30 p.m. local time, and I encourage all participants from the audience to comment and send their question through the Q&A button or by simply raising their digital hand. So I would start first with you, Johanne, and then Vicent, and then Gareth. So please, Johanne, the floor is yours. You have 10-15 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be almost in Italy. Let's put it this way, in South Tyrol, right from Montreal, where it's a little earlier. So thank you for allowing me to put my head through your really interesting. And I really look forward to the conversation with colleagues. Let me just share my screen, if I may, because before anything, I would like, in a spirit of friendship, solidarity, and reconciliation, to pay homage to the first peoples of the land from which I'm talking to you today. This territory, which was never ceded to newcomers, was long a meeting place of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations, a meeting place of indigenous peoples, and is now the meeting place of people who come from all over the world. this in 10 minutes is what I'd like to cover. And frankly, that means there will be a lot of shortcuts. I'm expecting people to know some of the background. And if that's not the case, then of course, please, by all means, ask questions during the question period. The first thing I want to do is talk about who are the old and the new minorities in Canada, because they might not be exactly the ones that we think about. Then the distinct impact of immigration on these old and new minorities. And I'll focus mostly on the current situation in Quebec, which is probably what is most, is expected. And this is where the core of the tensions currently occur. So who are the old and the new ones? Most people who know something about Canada will probably know about the tensions between, or the relationships between Canada and Quebec, will know that Canada is a federation and that Quebec is one of the provinces of this federation. Quebec is, the Québécois, the francophones of Quebec, have benefited from territorial federalism. So basically having a territory in which they are a majority, despite the fact that they are a minority overall in Canada. And on that territory, they have we have resources, we have jurisdiction, we have institutions, and basically this is how autonomy has been incarnated, if you will, for the Québécois. But of course, the first old minority, who of course normally we don't discuss as minorities, are the Indigenous peoples of Canada. They represent between 6 and 8% of the current population, but of course they were there before. It's very difficult to assess how many different nations there are, but it's somewhere between 60 and 200, depending on how we count. Indigenous peoples, when Canada was colonized, when Canada was created, and even until very recently, were not considered constitutional actors. They were treated in the Constitution of 1867, which is still current today, more as objects of legislation than as subjects and actors. But of course, they are part of the overall constitutional scheme, and they have probably been, and I'm anticipating from next slide, they of course have been the most impacted on immigration, because for Indigenous peoples, we are all immigrants. And, what we have considered in comparative work to be old minorities, basically the British and the French, are not that different from an Indigenous perspective. So who are the old and new minorities, if we put it more in the scheme of the comparisons with groups in Europe? Of course, the old British and the old French. Canada was first colonized by the French and then conquered by the British. These groups have evolved. Basically, the old British stock is reduced through immigration. Canada is a country of immigration and has been for a long time. And of course, these are, oversimplifications, but there's still sort of old money from British and largely Scottish action in the 19th century. But overall, the self-definition of that group has completely evolved into multicultural Canadians. So the old English have become something different, and something different that includes diversity coming from immigration. So there's not a lot of tension between what used to be that old minority and current immigration policies. There was until the 60s, and we had racist policies of excluding Asian people from citizenship and so on. We had exclusionary policies to prevent Jews from coming into the country. There was a pro-European immigration policy until the 60s, but gradually this has shifted. And now, as I said, the definition of that old has transformed. So, the old and new there is actually quite fluid. The French, it's a little bit different. Let me start again with the Québécois francophone. I just said that group is a majority in Quebec, but and has had the benefit of territorial federalism to manage its own institutions. And we float uncomfortably between old ethno-nationalism and civic nationalism. it's more complex. The integration of newcomers into that community is more complex, and I'll come back to this. And then, of course, there are the other French-speaking minorities in the rest of the countries, about 1 million of them, who don't benefit from federalism. They are minorities in their province, and there are minorities at the federal level. They don't have autonomy. And of course, immigration has an impact on them as well, because they are very fragile minorities. So there's been quite an evolution here. The distinct impact I've already alluded to partly, Indigenous peoples becoming actors, having been invaded by immigration since the beginning of the colonization process, and Canada has a continuing colonization project in a way, although we are in the process of reconciliation and reconfiguration, partly perhaps from, just simply capacity, realpolitics. Indigenous peoples increasingly are seeking self-government, recognition, autonomy, participation, management of their own resources, recuperation of their land, and so on. But their policies are not directly anti-immigration. It's almost like it's a lost cause. Canada is overwhelmingly non-Indigenous, and it's overwhelmingly the result of immigration, ancient or old or new. So there's not a lot of, there's more a sort of a leave us alone kind of attitude. And they don't see immigrants as recent immigrants as more of a threat than old immigrants. In fact, not, because old minorities were the ones that actually sought to eliminate them, in what has been called a cultural genocide. So this old minority has a, almost an indifferent, I'm paraphrasing and simplifying, but almost an indifferent relationship to immigration currently. The old British, as I said, have basically endorsed multicultural federalism policies, and there's not, at least in political rhetoric, a lot of opposition. It doesn't mean there's no systemic racism or difficulties, particularly over the last 20 years. I'm saying this because until then, between the 60s and about 20 years ago, second-generation immigrants into Canada actually did better socioeconomically, and if you measure educational levels, than old stock Canadians. So they came in and were really active into making this work for themselves, their communities, and their families. But the type of immigration, the people that have actually come over the last 20 years have created more difficulties that way. So again, immigration is just part of Canada's makeup. Over 250,000 to about 350,000, sometimes 450,000 people come in legally into Canada every year through various forms of immigration programs and refugee programs. Let's go back to the French, because this is where it's more complicated. The Francophones were about 40% of the Canadian population when Canada was created in 1867. We are now under 22%. So, the dilution of Francophones in Canada is the result largely of, of course, demographic decline, but of immigration, because most immigrants into Canada don't integrate into the French community either outside Quebec, and for a long time didn't in Quebec either, until the 60s, 70s, when policies were put into place to encourage newcomers to actually integrate into the French community, partly through linguistic legislation and education, where everyone except for old stock, and I'll call them like that, I can define it later if it's necessary, old stock Anglophones have a right to their schools, but otherwise everyone else has to go to French school, whether you're an immigrant or Francophone, or whether you come from Jamaica or you speak English, you still have to go to French school. The only people, only old stock or Canadians of different forms can go, who have had an education in English can go to English school. The other French-speaking minorities, as I said, have a different relationship, and their battle with immigration is actually to get quotas of immigrants who will come into their double minority communities and status. So they're a minority in Canada, they're a minority in their own provinces. Every province gets immigrants, once the sort of international, the national quotas are set, the provinces get a certain number, and normally they fight to get immigrants. And the question is, how many immigrants who are French speaking or likely to speak French or likely to integrate into the French speaking minority in those provinces, how many are they going to have? So we have official policies, programs, funding from the federal government to try to encourage people who immigrate from, let's say, the Congo to go and set up in Saskatchewan as opposed to Quebec. That works to a certain extent, but it's complicated. And so again, there's no tensions in a sense with immigration. There's a tension with getting the right immigrants and getting enough immigrants to stop the sociodemographic decline of those minorities who are really fragile. They need newcomers who speak French, basically to keep their communities going and their schools open. So they are actually quite welcoming, at least from the policy perspective. Just in a few minutes I have left, let me talk a bit about the situation in Quebec. We've just had elections in early October. The new members of the Legislative Assembly, which we call the National Assembly, are being sworn in as it is. And if you're interested into a bit of a crown kind of saga, there's a whole question about a number of them who don't want to swear allegiance to Charles III. So there's actually a constitutional, story unfolding right now here about whether they can do that or not. But what was particularly fascinating was that immigration and integration of newcomers into Quebec, so that's elections at the Quebec level, were key issues. They were constantly debated, but perhaps surprisingly, maybe not for Scotland, but for continental Europe, every party agreed that immigration was a good thing, that there was a value in immigration, and that we should have, an immigration policy, an open immigration policy. So that's from the left to the right, from the nationalists, sovereigntists, independence-seeking groups to the federalist multiculturalists. So left, right, and every angle, every party actually agreed on this. What the battles were about, there were battles of numbers. How many can we take? We don't have a control. There's a bit of a control over immigrants and refugees. And one story that we could talk about is that there's very little illegal immigration into Canada. There is more than we think, because there are people who come who become undocumented after. But I mean, just look at our geography. It's very, very, very difficult to arrive into Canada. But when they arrive through the United States, mostly Latin Americans, 90% of them come through Quebec for reasons I can describe later. But that has created a bit of an issue about how many are coming and who's going to fund services for those newcomers who come through the illegal route. But as soon as they land into Canada, the police is there to welcome them, give them blankets, and take them to hotels. So I mean, there's a system to take them into care, but until they have their immigration hearing and their refugee hearing. But still, that creates tension, because there is for all sorts of geographical reasons, they mostly come through Quebec. So there's battles of numbers. Basically, how many, and the question seems to be all the time, how many can we effectively integrate into the French-speaking community? We need workers. There's a huge deficit of labor force, as almost everywhere, but here it's really, really crucial. Businesses are closed, restaurants are closing because there's not enough staff. So basically, immigrants are needed for this. How many can we have, and how many can we integrate into the French communities? And that means regionalizing within Quebec immigration, so they don't all stay in Quebec, and basically making sure that they have access to French classes and so on and so forth. There's battles of jurisdiction. So, and immigration in Canada is a concurrent jurisdiction. We have very few official concurrent jurisdiction in Canada. That's one of them. So basically the federal order can legislate and provinces can legislate over immigration. Over the years, they've decided between themselves through all sorts of arrangements and agreements who does what in terms of immigration. And right now, the current government, which is a center-right populist nationalist party with a very strong majority, it was reconducted, is in battle with Ottawa to get more jurisdiction over certain types of immigration, family reunification, partly and short-term workers, because they feel that or argue that those are the groups that are less likely to learn French and integrate into French community. But there's partisan politics there. So battles of numbers, battles of jurisdiction, battle about integration into French society, just to give you the tone in which this was happening. So everybody agrees, during the electoral campaign that immigration is a good thing. But then the Minister of Immigration of the previous government, which has been reconducted, we don't know yet what will happen to that minister, but it's fairly clear that he will not get his job back, said in a meeting, over 80% of immigrants in Montreal, because that's where most immigrants go, don't speak French and don't work. And this was factually untrue, and this was understood as being xenophobic. He had to apologize immediately. Again, the whole spectrum, from the prime minister of his own party to all the other parties, everybody disowned that statement. But it created, there was a bit of that tone. It's happening outside of Quebec, which is really French, and outside of Montreal, looking at what's happening in Montreal and sort of trying to demonize what's happening in Montreal. But that gives you the tone.
Johanne, please go to your conclusion. So that
I'll conclude with the last two bullets and just a chart, and in 3 minutes I'm done. Thank you. The battle for French, which has been the story of all this, to what extent is immigration supporting the resistance of the French, the small enclave of Francophones in North America, and to what extent is it a threat to that old minority, has now integrated issues of secularism and laïcité. So the Quebec political classes overall, with different types of coloring, but endorse more of a state neutrality approach. And the nationalist parties tend to take one that is more aligned to what happens in Europe, particularly in France, which clashes with multiculturalism to a certain extent. And the clash has occurred recently, and I can go into more details if need be, but over the hijab, basically. And this has led to sort of the definition of identity, the Quebec identity being defined by French and being defined by laïcité, and that has been understood as being exclusionary, for instance, because there's legislation banning the wearing of religious signs for people in authority, and including school teachers. And school teachers are overwhelmingly women. If you want immigrants to come and speak French, guess what? A lot of them come from North Africa. Guess what? A lot of them will increasingly wear hijabs. So now there's a clash between getting people to speak French and people who wear hijabs, and that's seen as a clash of values, profound values. And this creates a state of unwelcome to immigration, despite the fact that there is still immigration happening and that everybody says they want immigration, including the general public and businesses. I'll close with this slide. The perception by immigrants of the way they're treated has an impact on how they feel they belong to either Quebec or Canada. And I've put the source at the bottom. Have a look at that study because it's really quite fascinating. Because basically, and I'm synthesizing here, but the individual experience of exclusion by the immigrants who were polled are very similar, including for Muslims. Their personal experience, whether they're in Quebec or they're in other provinces that were part of this study. But that translates into a different kind of political reaction. When they're not treated well, they will tend to not blame their province. They might blame the overall Canada. It might decrease their sense of belonging to Canada. When it happens in Quebec, it turns against Quebec. And they blame Quebec for the unwelcome they get, even though their personal experience are very similar. And that's partly because of the overall rhetoric around immigration and around this legislation over laïcité and another piece of legislation about the French language that we've just had. And I close on this because some of you might be interested in this, because these two major legislation have been subject to what we call the notwithstanding clause. That means the National Assembly has voted that they will be protected from judicial review on constitutional basis, from charter review. So that again creates a sense of unwelcome on the part of immigrants and other Democrats. Thank you. I'm sorry if I was a little long.
No. Thank you, Johanne. And thanks for this overview on the complexity and transformation also of groupings and in terms of categories and sense of belonging, the impact and their perception also of the migration policy. And it's also always astonishing to see these in comparison to Europe in general. I can generalize this sort of general agreement among political parties on the need and value of migration that is so rare, difficult to find in European elections. But again, your final points reminds us again that the usual controversial points are religion, cultural practices, values. We all go in the end the same, which impacts on the sense of belonging and sense of identity. So here I see many similarities. But Vicent, now the floor is yours. You have 10-15 minutes.
Yeah, I'll be very short. Do you see my screen? Yep, perfect. Well, grazie, Roberta. Thanks, everybody. As you know, I'll be talking about migration and self-government in Catalonia. Before I start my presentation, I'd like you to take a look at the graph if you can. Let me see if I can show it. Much better now, right? Just this is the Catalan population, the evolution and the composition with the three different places of origin. One is the blue one, is the people born in Catalonia in 1981 represented 63.4%. And in 2019, 64%. So almost the same. Those born in the rest of Spain, it goes, the numbers go from 34.4 in 81 to 16.6 in 2019. So figures have gone down quite remarkably. And then we have the people born abroad. They represented a little bit more than 1% in 1981 to almost now at the figures that we have now, it's 22%. Those that you have on the screen is 19.1. So as you can see, migration is not something small in Catalonia. It's a major issue, a major change that has impacted the Catalan society. And also, as I will explain later, the Catalan language, because it resonated when Johanne was talking about the French, it really resonates a lot in Catalonia. A little bit of other data. This is the percentage of migrant population, what we call millennials between 25 and 34 years of age. In the old, this is only Barcelona, right? These are the districts that Barcelona has, the city of Barcelona. The district with the highest migrant population is 82%. The figure that goes down, it's only 23%. So in the neighborhood with the least number of migrants is the last one, Sant Gervasi, but it's 33%. So just you have an idea of the impact of migration in our society. And in this case, I talked about Catalonia, and now I'm talking about Barcelona. In any system, I will now go broadly. We have three elements that in any society: the demographic system, economy, and social cultural system, if you want. The demographic system has three main elements. One is mortality and health. Another one is marriages or couples and births. And then we have migration. Just let's go back to the figures I just presented. Births in Catalonia almost, the same level as in like 40 years ago. Mortality and health, as I was explaining before, and Catalonia grows thanks to migration. Then going to the economic and the social cultural aspects, here you have the migration and the economy needs any element that refers to the economy is social mobility. And in Catalonia, it is linked, it's very tightly linked to the Catalan language. So education needs to be focuses on Catalan as the main language of instruction. It's one of the main elements in Catalan society that no matter where you're from, you're integrated through school into the Catalan school, which has Catalan as the vehicular, as the language of instruction, right? More arrows here and there. It's very simple. What I'm trying to do with this graph is that social mobility, everybody expects to grow and to have properties, to have production, to have a reproductive work, and then everything is tightly linked between the demographic system, the economy, and the social cultural system. What is happening now in our society? And again, the language, as you see on at the bottom right hand side of the screen, language is one of the main elements that we have in Catalonia, as you were saying, Johanne, in Quebec. That language is the main differentiating element that makes the difference between the rest of Spain and Catalonia. What is happening in our society now? It's that the third pillar of my graph is broken. It's not working. It's shattered into pieces. Why? And now we have to find the solution or the answer into the economic system of Catalonia. The Catalan socio-economic model, it comes mainly from the tertiary sector. It's very open to tourism, and we have many underqualified and precarious jobs developed mainly by migrants. There is a dichotomy that we have here. The authorities consider migration is very important, is perceived as something positive. It's the most relevant transformation that society the Catalan society is undergoing. So the demographic composition. However, what's happening, the Catalan language, which is at the core of any strategy for more self-government and requesting more self-government to the state, the Catalan language is perceived by migrants as non-useful. Why? Because it's becoming only for the Catalans. Because since our economy is so based on the tertiary sector, open to tourism, as I said before, more and more we don't have any state, as maybe in Quebec you have, or that you can have support. The problem that we have is that the Catalan are being more and more minoritized. So all the plans, all the national plans, all the immigration plans from the government of Catalonia consider Catalan as the key element for a cohesive multicultural society, and that looks very good on paper. However, when it comes to reality, the clash or the differences between migrants, and as you saw before, migrants are more and more part of the population. We're seeing a more and more not divided society, but more ghettos being created. That's one of the main aspects that I wanted to emphasize, the importance of identity, language, and this reality due to internationalism, the socio-economic model of Catalonia and Spain. And another element that is quite concerning is that the Catalan government requests more and more competence to manage migration at the regional level, because Spain has the full exclusive powers of border control and nationality. And then the communities have the power of managing integration. But integration means reception, housing, education, work, all those regional/local elements. However, to do that, you need money. And the problem is that since we have more and more people and the migration figures skyrocketing every year, we meaning the Catalan government is enabled to manage and to be able to give the response in terms of integration, in terms of economic integration, reception, housing, Catalan courses. So it's money that is not transferred from the state into the regions, and then there is an important problem in that respect. Going back to my slide, and the last slide, you can see it on the screen, right? Yeah. Again, the now the figures, the pattern is repeated. 2020, 2021, we're almost at 22% of migrant population. The people from the rest of Spain is going down, and the people born in Catalonia remains the same. So the main challenge is how to cope with these migration figures without the resources and the power necessary to cope with them. I don't know if you remember the terrorist attacks in 2017, I think, or 17, I think it was. It was a shock because the people who committed those attacks were people born and raised of foreign origin, but born and raised in Catalonia, in a small village. So our question is, what is happening in our society that we have people born and raised here and doing those types of things? So the perception in Catalonia is that we are unable, or Catalonia is unable to cope with the necessary developments that are needed to manage migration. So this is what I wanted to say for the debate. I hope it's been useful, and I'm very happy to
Thanks a lot,
continue.
Vicent. You raised many points. Apart this focus on the demographic composition of the population and how all of these issues impact not only demographic elements, but also the economy, and reminds me a bit really the importance of the migration policy, because as Johanne mentioned before, Quebec, for example, attracted migrants from Francophone countries, but then they could not, or they had to cope with also the religious difference that many of these migrants brought with them into the Canadian Quebec society. So it's something that has to be foreseen, perhaps anticipated also by public authorities and policy makers. And the same in Catalonia as well. The third sectors, entrepreneurs, attract migrants, and so politicians somehow facilitate these because it's also their votes. They want to be re-elected, but then they tend to overshade or neglect also the fact that many of these people perhaps are not interested in learning Catalan language, and it's difficult to force them, obviously. And so again, there are various elements and factors at stake, and it's difficult to decide which one should prevail in the end. But let's move now to Scotland with Gareth. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Roberta. Yeah, already I can see some really useful similarities and differences between the three cases, and as I hope will become clear, what I'm going to talk about possibly has more similarities with some of what Johanne was saying around the battle between the kind of sub-state authority and the central authority around migration-related issues. But of course, we don't have the language issue to deal with on top of that. So thank you very much for the invite to come and speak. Yes, perhaps it's useful from my point of view to go back to when I was actually in Bolzano in 2015. Because what we just experienced was an independence referendum. And there's two important things about that referendum that I think translate into what I was just saying about the battle between the centre and the periphery. One is the franchise. The Scottish government at the time had control over the franchise, and the Scottish government opened up voting rights for anybody ordinarily resident in Scotland. So that meant that many migrant populations had the right to vote, which is in stark contrast to what happened in the Brexit referendum, for example. But also in terms of the results of that referendum, the work that has been done would suggest that most long-term settled communities, minority communities in Scotland, voted to leave the UK. And most newer communities were pretty evenly split. So, for example, I did a bit of work that looked at polls. They were pretty evenly split between yes and no, whereas people of Pakistani origin were emphatically in favour of independence. And other studies have shown kind of similar, but slightly different numbers, but a similar kind of trend. So that kind of brief outline of the kind of independence part of the issue brings us, I suppose, to a little bit of the history of migration in Scotland, because it sets a lot of the context. And importantly, to that context is that Scotland has historically been a very, very white country, and it remains a very white country. Scotland's main experience with migration right up until the 1960s was of Irish Catholics, and those Irish Catholics were subject to a huge amount of anti-Irish racism when they arrived in Scotland. But Scotland still remains very white, although that did start to change, and migration patterns started to change in the late 1990s. A large part of the reason for the change has been about demographic decline. Scotland has been subject to far more outward migration than it has inward migration for most of its history. And there's been a real concerns about the lack of replacement labour in the Scottish context. In the late 1990s, we also, on the election of a new Labour government, saw the opening up of labour migration. Labour migration becomes an integral part of the government's overall economic strategy. So that increases migration to the UK much more broadly, and obviously with that increases migration to Scotland as well. We also see at that point asylum dispersal beginning, which means that Glasgow City Council becomes the largest asylum dispersal area in the UK, the largest single local authority, taking round about 10% of asylum applicants each year of its existence. There's a massive geographical concentration. It's interesting what Vicent was saying about Barcelona there. There are still huge areas of Scotland that are massively white and come from the kind of traditional Scottish communities, for want of a better term. Whereas in places like Edinburgh and Glasgow, you see over 17% identifying as being part of a minority. In the Glasgow context, that will quite often include second, third, fourth generation Irish Catholic immigrants as well, though. So it's important we don't try and homogenise these populations in any way. The politics of migration also began to change in the establishment of Scottish Parliament in 1999, with the Fresh Talent Initiative, which allowed international students to stay and work in Scotland for up to 2 years after graduation. And we had the kind of touchstone issue of the vow to end dawn raids, the early morning removal of refused asylum seekers, which is carried out by the Home Office. And this re-emerged as a big issue in Scotland just last year with the so-called Battle of Kenmure Street, which I'm quite happy to talk about a little bit later on if anyone's interested. So a lot of what we in Scotland are doing around migration issues, I suppose, is trying to differentiate ourselves in some ways from UK policy and policy making. Many of you will know about the hostile environment that the UK government has instituted over many years, supposedly aimed towards unregulated migrants, irregular migrants, where the kind of stated the stated population that these policies were aimed at, but there was massive slipover effects and encompassed a lot more than just these irregular migrants, as if attention to them wasn't enough. And what that's led to is the huge restrictions in the rights, the social rights of migrant populations, and a massive extension of the number of immigration actors, where public and private bodies and individuals become part of the UK government's immigration control regime. More recently, we have what's been described by many people as the most regressive piece of immigration legislation in the Western world today, the 2002 Immigration Act, and with that, the Rwanda Plan, which effectively legalises the right to seek asylum in the UK. And again, I can go into more detail about that if there's any interest in that. The policy in Scotland, I think, has been different. Scotland has no control over immigration policy, but it does have control over a huge raft of immigrant policy, to use Thomas Hammer's contrast in the past. So to mirror the kind of extension of the franchise and the independence referendum, just a few years ago, refugees were granted the right to vote in all elections that the Scottish Government has jurisdiction over. So that's elections to the Scottish Parliament and to local authorities. There's much greater access to social citizenship rights such as access to higher education. So in Scotland, you have to be here for a shorter period of time before you qualify as a home student, so therefore don't have to pay fees to attend university. And resettlement numbers of refugees are much higher per capita in Scotland than they are in other parts of the UK. Syrian resettlement, for example, between 2015 and 2020, the UK government aimed to resettle 20,000 Syrians. And despite being about 8% of the overall population, Scotland took around about 17 or 18% of Syrian refugees at that point. And that has been replicated in terms of Ukrainian refugees, as the Scottish Government applied and was granted the right to be a super sponsor for Ukrainian refugees. The discourse has also been really different. The UK government has used really vitriolic language over a long period of time towards migrant populations, where they're variously been described as being clandestines, illegals, invaders, and swarms, to use David Cameron's term shortly before he was forced to leave office. You don't get these types of debates and arguments within the Scottish Parliament, even from the Conservative Party. Even the Conservative Party, the kind of sister party of Boris Johnson, Theresa May et al., don't use that same kind of vitriolic language, and similarly to what Johanne was saying, actually do quietly advocate the need for migration to Scotland, mostly for economic and demographic reasons. The Scottish Government presents itself as being very different from that kind of discourse. And just to give you one example, in discussions about the 2022 Act, Social Justice Secretary Shona Robinson said that the Act puts Scotland's reputation as a country of welcome and refuge at serious risk. Those are more like the types of debates that take place within the Scottish Parliament. It's worth also saying, though, that there are contradictions. Actually, I'll come back to that later on, some of the contradictions. To move on to kind of issues around public opinion and voting, it's worth saying that attitudes towards migration in Scotland are very nuanced and are often very contradictory, and attitudes, like many others, fluctuate according to world events, according to national events. There tend to be very marginal differences between Scotland and England in terms of social attitude surveys. The common questions such as should migration be increased or reduced, the differences tend to be very marginal, although Scotland tends to sit around just below the levels of London and the southeast in terms of being more supportive towards increased migration. But there's far less salience in the Scottish political context, whereas polling over the past 20 years or so, the English and Welsh population have tended to put migration usually around about second in terms of the importance of, compared to other political issues. In Scotland, it's tended to be a lot further down. So it's not deemed as being as important an issue in terms of kind of Scottish politics. And in elections themselves, there has always been quite limited support for anti-immigration politics and parties elections. The Conservative Party have never had the majority number of seats from Scotland since the 1950s, and UKIP have never had much traction within the Scottish political scene, despite them having a huge amount of influence in terms of Westminster politics. And since 2007, when the Scottish National Party were elected, Hepburn and Rosie have described them as the most pro-immigration of all major parties in the UK. So there is a different kind of political sense of what migration is than in other parts of the UK. Just very briefly to talk about one example of the impacts of this. This is a project that I was working on up until relatively recently. We were looking at resettled Syrians, refugees' experiences of settlement in Scotland and England. And what we found was really drastic differences in terms of how Syrians were experienced in their lives. And for me, the most important point about this one was about the British population. This was people Syrian refugees were interacting with on a daily or weekly basis. And in Scotland, these Syrian refugees evaluated their experiences far, far more positively than those in England. And I think what this perhaps suggests is that the different policy context and the different discourse can have an effect in terms of how people experience their lives. And what this means in a practical sense is that more Syrians in Scotland want to stay in Scotland than those in England. Now, you might say this is exactly what both governments want. The Scottish government want people to come and stay. The UK government don't particularly want people to come and stay. So you may think in a kind of pragmatic way that this makes a bit of sense, but it's all encompassed in this kind of wider sense in which, in the way in which politics plays out within the two states. So just to very briefly summarise, what I don't want to imply here is that Scotland is an anti-racist, non-racist beacon of hope. There is an excellent book written by some colleagues of mine called No Problem Here. I've missed out the question mark there, unfortunately. No Problem Here, question mark, which is about the history and existence of racism in Scotland. Scotland has its very, very distinct problems with racism. So I don't want to try to suggest that this isn't an issue in Scotland, because it is. I think we often seek comfort in the comparisons that we try to make. I think we in Scotland, I've got a bit of a comfort blanket where we compare Holyrood to Westminster, because Westminster is so awful around migration issues that we can't but look good in comparison. I think if we compare ourselves to some other subnational states, we may see quite drastic differences in terms of how we think we come out in comparison to those. And there are contradictions in the way that the Scottish government has behaved around migration issues as well. Just to give you one example, there is a lot of institutional support for the Gaelic language in Scotland. There are more Urdu speakers in Scotland, and now there are more Polish speakers in Scotland than there are Gaelic speakers, and they get no financial support from the central government for support for those languages. So there's a contradiction there. They term these heritage languages, so that it's a kind of harken back to a kind of white Scottish past that I think is somewhat problematic. However, I do think it's worth saying that there is a different political culture around migration in Scotland. And furthermore, that I think the evidence is that those differences in political culture are growing bigger rather than shrinking. and some of the kind of language around migration that led into the Brexit debate, for example, I think signified that these divergences are increasing rather than reducing. So I'll finish up there. Thanks.
Thank you, Gareth. And thanks for having focused on the relationship between the central national immigration policy and the policy of Scotland, of the devolved regime. And yeah, and also another important element that somehow is also common to the three territories is the referendum that was, or in Catalonia, perhaps a consultation should be called, that actually have been celebrated or in the three territories very recently, and this bring me to my question. I don't know if it was just a coincidence, but basically the three territories that you represent, that you analyzed, that you presented, have a sort of a positive, I would say, generally positive approach towards migration and towards diversity also, in comparison to other autonomous regions and also non-autonomous regions. I don't know if this was, as I said, a coincidence, but my question is whether you see a difference between your territory, let's say, because it's an autonomous territory, and territories that are not autonomous in the country, so UK, Spain, or Canada, whether the fact that Scotland, Catalonia, and Quebec are autonomous territories has somehow facilitated the adoption of pro-diversity or inclusionary policies, and if so, which are the factors that you think are more relevant? Or do you think that this was just a coincidence, and that basically you could have been also non-autonomous and be inclusionary, or in contrast have a very defensive and exclusionary policy? Do you think that this made a difference? Please, Vicent.
Yeah, thanks, Roberta. I think it does for one reason, at least in Catalonia, and this has been very explicit. Catalonia sees migration as an opportunity to reshape the nation-building strategy and to use the Catalan language as the differentiating element. For example, the former vice president of Catalonia used to say, if you're from Latin America and you go to Madrid, you will always be Latin American because you have an accent, you look different, etc. If you go to Catalonia and you learn Catalan, you're already one part of us. So you're already one of us. So it's the key element. That's why I was very happy to hear what Johanne said about, well, interested, more than happy to hear what Johanne was saying about the importance of French in Quebec, and here it's exactly the same. The importance of Catalan as a way of projecting the nation building strategy. However, the problem is that that's a lot of wishful thinking. But the reality, as I said before in my presentation, the tertiary sector is so high that the Catalan authorities would love immigrants to learn Catalan, but the reality that it's not being the case, or at least not as much as the Catalan authorities would like it to be.
Is Johanne or Gareth?
If I
Please,
may,
Johanne.
Thank you. This is a complicated one because, I guess it depends who you consider to have autonomy or not. I mean, Canada is a full-fledged federation. There are 10 provinces and 3 territories that all have the same level of autonomy in terms of jurisdiction. Quebec has over the years negotiated more powers in immigration in exchange for funding from Ottawa. So there's money coming from Ottawa, partly to help immigrants integrate into French, and Quebec selects a large part of its immigrants on the basis of a different type of point system than the rest of Canada. So in that sense, you could argue that this has created a stronger sense of control, of community, of inclusion, particularly since, for now, 40 years or most, newcomers have had to go, at least their kids go to French school. So the parents might not always learn French easily. It depends, again, on socioeconomic. Some groups, when you have intellectuals moving into Quebec following a war, they learn French. The Asian diaspora, of course, is French speaking and so on, but sometimes they don't, but their children will. That's the story. The question is that over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a reversal of that. We've seen people, at least in Montreal, not learning French as much as before, and English becoming more dominant. So partly, we are in a similar but very different constellation. I mean, we are 8 million in a continent of 350 million English speakings, and it's English. I mean, it's English. My kids listen to Netflix in English. They don't listen to Netflix with subtitled or dubbed. So English is very present, and English is largely concentrated in Montreal. So I think when you're talking about autonomy, one thing that struck me was that municipalities in our system don't have a lot of autonomy. They're not an order of government. They do have a certain degree of autonomy, but they, if you had to redesign the federation, you probably would design it very differently. With Montreal having almost, not quite, but a third of the Quebec population, having a very distinct socio-demographic makeup, and having, different patterns of immigration and integration and so on. And right now you see it when you see the electoral map. It is completely blue outside of Montreal, pale blue, which is the governing party, and Montreal is, different constellations, but it's not blue. So there's a real difference here. And that means that Montreal, where the immigration process is not happening, doesn't have control over what is happening on its territory to the same degree. So in a sense, it hasn't been discussed that way, but autonomy would lead us to question these kinds of issues. So the battle isn't only between the Canadian government and Quebec, but it's within Quebec, what is happening within Quebec. And when you said that there was a positive attitude towards diversity and inclusion in immigrants, I would say yes, to a certain extent. But I think things are slightly changing. At least the tone is changing. I don't know if the reality on the ground is changing that much, whether it was sort of political, electoral politics, but the adoption of, for instance, this latest legislation on laïcité, especially protected from constitutional review on freedom of religion grounds, has created this sense that the Québécois who vote overall overwhelmingly that blue color are against immigrants. And I'll just launch it like that. But recently I've been wondering whether Quebec right now is not turning into Flanders. Quebec and Flanders have followed each other in many ways. The nationalist movement being left of center at the beginning and being a claim for social justice with linguistic justice over, reversing historical exclusion, although the demographics were different. And then we saw Flanders becoming quite nationalist and right-wing, and even with, extreme right and so on, and with quite a divide between cities and the rural areas, although they're much closer than ours. And Quebec was, remained open and left of closer to Scotland in a way. And now there's something happening. And the overall context that you're talking about, Gareth, and that we haven't heard much yet from Vicent about this, but you know, that who you're comparing with. I mean, I think overall, if we compared what happens in Scotland, what happens in Quebec, probably the policies are quite similar, and this level of satisfaction is fairly similar, and level of exclusion and discrimination might be fairly similar. But what you're contrasting with is, quote unquote, the evil UK versus the multicultural, open arm Canada, even though the experience might be very similar. So what you're contrasting it with is actually very, you know, might be very different, but there is a change of tone and a change of policy, particularly suspending the application of fundamental rights, that is making some of us really quite concerned.
Gareth, and I have a couple of questions in the Q&A.
A depressing bombshell you've just thrown at the end there, Johanne. Yeah, I mean, I think I would go back to what Vicent was saying about nation building. I don't think there is a comparative part of the UK to Scotland in the sense of having a nation building project, which is separate from the UK nation building project. The only comparison you could make would be with Wales, and I think the Welsh government, the Welsh society, you could probably periodise pre and post Brexit, or the Brexit debate. Like at one point, Wales was right up there with one of the most pro immigration parts of the UK, and then somehow in the run up to the Brexit debate, the kind of xenophobia and racism of much of the Brexit debate seemed to infect a lot of Welsh politics in the way that I don't necessarily think it managed to do in Scotland, and that was possibly because the Scottish government had more power. So there was a sense in which there was a clash of political values, political ideas between Westminster and Holyrood. I think in terms of the Scottish context as well, I think immigration issues are also bound up with a whole series of other broader socio-economic political issues. And I think there is a sense in which, as the UK government has successfully moved away from what was defined as being the post-45 welfare consensus, the UK government has abandoned that consensus, and even before the SNP came to power, there was a sense in which Scottish authorities were trying to hold on to some of that consensus. And within that consensus was a support for multicultural politics, for example, which the UK government has also, I think, moved drastically away from. Since 2007, obviously, we've had in power an independence supporting government. So they'll be much more explicit in their kind of nation building project and their desire to have control over migration, but also to encourage migration.
Mm-hmm. I have a question from Dorothy Zinn from University of Bolzano. And she asked to the three of you how prospects are for social mobility for migrants in the three areas, and if it's possible to generalize across the various national groups present. It may be that this impacts the desire to learn Catalan in the Catalonian context. And then she also had another point, following what Johanne said about the decline of French learning in recent years. I now wonder if social mobility within Quebec for migrants is a factor there too. So, a question to the three of you. So, is social mobility? How are the prospects for social mobility for migrants in the three areas? And is it possible to generalize across the various groups that are present? Because obviously, I mean, Vicent, when you presented, for example, the demographic structure, was wondering, you had this list of the country of their nationality, or their, and obviously I immediately thought whether there is a difference between in terms of mobility, whether we're talking about EU citizens or non-EU. And the same, Gareth, you mentioned that migration in Scotland was initially very white. I mean, I was a bit shocked about this term, but I know it is like this. It's very white, and I'm wondering how these impacts also on the referendum, and the Brexit also decision, the majority about. The difference between the so-called Polish plumber and whether this was actually is a very white component of the migration population, but still also a competitor in the economic terms. So I'm wondering how this social mobility can be generalized as migration is composed by very different groups. And same, Johanne, also about the decline of French learning. Again, social mobility may be very much impacted by this, because I guess also the policy will be modified by, perhaps modified, and the idea to attract more people who can speak French, but who are also Muslim in their faith might also impact. And actually there is also a second question on this point, but we will move after that. Please, the floor is yours. Be short if you can, because we have just 15 minutes and other questions. So
very
Johanne.
short.
Oh, Vicent, no, you started first. No,
go ahead, Vicent.
All right, very short. On the one hand, the rhetoric, the narrative of the official rhetoric, the official narrative says that Catalan is needed for social mobility. I'm always focusing on Catalan because it's on the language, because it's a key element in the integration. But however, the reality is that it's not needed. That's the problem, that since we are so into the tertiary sector, services, tourism, so you need English. So the fact is that, and the local people are so underpaid, doctors and nurses, even qualified people, they go abroad to have a better job. So who comes to Catalonia? And it's the same for Spain, people from all over the world. So what happens is that, and people from all over the world, obviously they don't speak Catalan. So just to summarize, the rhetoric, the narrative, yes, social Catalan is the key for social mobility, for the social ladder. The reality is not.
Johanne.
Yes, you asked a lot of questions there, so let me.
I know. Sorry.
Following up, Vicent, and historically, in Montreal and in Quebec, you didn't need French for social mobility. It was quite the opposite. One generation ago, a bit over, because my parents' generation, the statistics were that if you were a unilingual Anglophone, you earned more than if you were a bilingual Francophone. That changed only in the 70s and 80s with language policies and with the Francophones taking over through what we call the Quiet Revolution, taking over basically the state of Quebec, through what I call territorial federalism, through autonomy, using the autonomy that the system provided to its maximum, using the resources and, delving into the resource of indigenous peoples as we did that, but basically using these resources to become a French-speaking country within the federation. And at that stage, speaking French was required to do a lot of different things. Now, a large number of Anglophones at that time left for Ontario in the 70s when that French power took over. Today, we might have called it all sorts of things, what was happening then, but it did happen. Those who stayed basically accepted that they had to learn French. Whether they needed it for social mobility or not, it wasn't quite clear. But it was basically understood that to get to work for the government, to get to work for businesses, because now people like me would request to be served in French in stores, whereas my parents often had to be served in English in Montreal, in downtown Montreal. So there was a change. What has changed now? And again, it's a broad generalization. And let me try to capture it a little bit. But when I was a young adult, there was a correspondence between linguistic justice and socioeconomic. We wanted people to speak French so that we could all, it was politics and recognition, but it was also because we wanted to be masters over our territory and within our nation and not be dominated by English-speaking people. Now the politics have changed. The quote unquote, the English-speaking people have changed. They're no longer the old stock, sorry, Gareth, but post-colonial Scots who developed Montreal. They are newcomers from India, Pakistan, and so on. So me, who now teaches, and ironically, of course, in an English-speaking university, so me who teaches university, my mother didn't finish primary school. I teach university. I mean, this is where it happened. French in public schools allowed us to do that. And now when I'm in a store and the person doesn't speak French to me, I don't insist on being served in French because that person is in a different social class, historic situation. And I don't want to be understood or as being racist. So unless they make an effort.
Patronizing,
patronizing or ethnic
paternalistic a bit.
It creates a bizarre kind of thing. So, and basically, sorry, I'm taking a long time to say this, but right now in Montreal, and there are exceptions, but what has happened, there's a return for all sorts of reasons, and we're not understanding that now you can again live in Montreal without learning French. And some of our students coming to McGill, our law students who are supposed to know both languages, we teach in both, will say they leave McGill less bilingual than they came to McGill. Because basically they live downtown, they go to McGill, their lives are in French, and then they can be hired in English, they can get hired in English and so on. So that creates insecurity again that we didn't have for about 30, 40 years. And that insecurity is leading to new policies which are understood to be exclusionary and anti-immigrants. So that's for the French. Now, just about Muslims, I think there's that tension that you mentioned earlier. Basically, the Quebec modernity describes itself, understands itself, although it's post-Christian, as very anti-religion. We're 2 generations away from a Catholic theocracy, and we fought really hard to get rid of it. And the vision of religion in the public space creates allergies. Now, when that combines with probably anti-Muslim sentiments around the world and so on, that is not healthy. But what, the attack seems to be on our profound identity. If there's one value that the Quebecois share, it's equality between men and women. Like it's probably what binds us most. And if anything looks like an attack on this or is projected as an attack on this, it will be rejected. Now, whether the hijab wearing is that or not, of course, can be debated, and people, don't share the same vision on this. But if it's projected as something that is an attack on equality between men and women, as a symbol of oppression of women, as some project, then it will create this backlash. Last thing about referendum, very different from Scotland. Here, the last referendum, we had 2 in 80 and in 95 on independence. And in the last, just to talk about the last one, 60% of the old minority, to go back to what we were talking about, people like my people of French descent, 60% voted in favor of independence. That means 40% didn't, but 60% did. Those who voted against, with those 40%, were Anglophones, the other old minority, and immigrants, first, second, third generation. And therefore, this led to some frustration that the nationalist project was never going to win the independence project because of the others. And that led that night, of the results to the premier of Quebec saying that the vote had been lost to money and ethnic voting. Now that was, again, there was so much and anger about that statement, including by, Francophones, that he had to apologize and resign for having made a statement that looked xenophobic or seemed or was xenophobic or frustration. But the result, because immigration has carried on, the result is now the demographics are such that unless we convince people, like in Scotland you managed to do, that independence is a good thing for them, even if they are immigrants, even if they are old minority, not Quebecois Francophones, unless there's something good about independence for them, they're never going to support it. And therefore, the Francophones are never going to be independent because, there's no question about depriving them of the vote or anything like that, but the demographics are that. And we're not convincing them that it's a good project. So, yeah.
Thanks, Johanne, for your frankness. Gareth, on top of the question on social mobility, if you want also to address the referendum, and there is also a question that Johanne already answers about the migrants with a Muslim background. There is a question by Memona Nadir, about integration of and the challenge of integrating Muslim,
I mean, I suppose I would think my starting point is that I don't think social mobility exists for anyone in British society right now. The statistics show that there is no social mobility. People aren't moving up and down social ladders. People are stuck within their social classes, and that mobility is part of the kind of British mythology. However, obviously for some communities, they have the added. They don't only have the kind of class-based immobility, but they also have the added issue of whether it's explicit racism or racialization, as has happened in the case of many Central and East European migrants. And there's lots of evidence that second names, for example, has a huge impact in terms of whether you get invited for a job or not, a job interview or not. Those experiences are still very existent in the Scottish context. So if you happen to have a Muslim-sounding second name, you're less likely to get invited for interview. So that the lack of social mobility interacts with both explicit and implicit racialization to exclude large parts of the Scottish population. I think Central and East Europeans are an interesting population as far as those issues are concerned, because I do think there was a period in which, in the UK more generally, Central and East Europeans were seen as being a positive thing. The migration of Central and East Europeans was seen as being a positive thing, and then in the Westminster context, that obviously slipped or shifted, switched, and there was some evidence within the Scottish context, for example, that what happened then was that Central and East European migrants started to try to emphasise their Europeanness rather than their migrantness, because these issues around racialisation didn't happen in the same way to the French or to the Germans or to the Danes or to the Scandinavians arriving here. So racialisation has really played out in quite a severe way to obstruct any attempt at mobility for large parts of the migrant populations in Scotland. As far as the referendum's concerned, so I think, so whether we have another legal referendum next year or not is still very much an open question. The Supreme Court are discussing that at the moment. My suspicion is they will say that we don't have the jurisdiction to do that, and then what happens next is a big question. But I think there's some interesting developments that have happened between 2014 and now. Now, like I said in my presentation, the evidence that we have is that in the run-up to the 2014 referendum, long-term settled minority communities tended to have moved to the yes side, and that was a real change. Historically, Scottish independence, Scottish nationalism was seen as being very much a kind of Presbyterian interest. So the fact that you had people of Irish Catholic origin shifting over, and latterly people of Pakistani origin, for example, largely this was seen as being as a response to UK foreign policy and the Islamophobia of UK policy. So there has been that shift from 2014. I think where we are now is if we have the same franchise, but if we have a second referendum, the issue of membership of the EU played a big part in the debates in 2014. And I think probably played a big part in terms of why Central and East European migrants, for example, were more split and less likely to vote yes to independence. Can't see that being the case next time round. If someone, for example, who's French or Polish, living in Scotland has the chance to vote for Scotland to become independent with the prospect of rejoining the European Union, that doesn't have the same impact as the fear of being thrown out the European Union had in 2014, where, as I said earlier on, polls were very split. So one guy I interviewed, for example, in 2014, talked about how he would rather take the risk of independence rather than risk David Cameron throwing us out of the European Union in a referendum. So it was quite a prescient comment, given what happened next. So I know that doesn't answer all of the questions, but it was an attempt to just
thanks, Gareth. Actually, we have 3 minutes, and I have a last question for you, but you have to be really telegraphic, or really yes, almost yes or no. And with this last question, I also include also another question that was in the chat, whether, and my question is about looking at the future. So do you think that there is, do you see the possibility for the development of a new sort of territorial overarching common identity that but perhaps you already have it? And as the question asks, whether all the new minorities, referring to all of the various groupings, may be allies in the quest, in the search for an inclusive multilingual society. Do you think that a sense is it possible to unite all various communities? Is a sort of peace and love final, or there will be always clashes, and there's no also need for search for this common sense of belonging, sort of common overarching territorial identity? It's better that each group maintain its own identity, and that's it. And we should look at the economy, we should look at the prosperity, and that's it. Identity won't be so important. The ethnic factor, the language, it's a sort of pre-modern thing. That's my, yeah, it's a provocation, but I need really few seconds from each of you. Please, Vicent, Johanne, you have to be short. Please,
I'll be very short.
Yes.
Lack of resources is leading to more and more separation of peoples within society, but not only migrants, also local, as Gareth says, the social ladder is broken. So about identity, the locals, the Catalans, are becoming more and more of a minority within themselves. So and people are more concerned about, having a job, having a place to live. So unfortunately, that's what I am experiencing and seeing over the past maybe 10 years. Yeah, so it's more, that's like peace and love. Maybe it's from the 70s, not anymore. I'll stop here.
Yeah, Johanne, very short.
Very short. I just want to challenge one of your premises where you said multicultural, multilingual, peace and love. In Canada, multicultural, but unilingual. The integration occurs in English, and we shrink diversity by doing it all in English, basically wanting to be Scotland at the Canadian level. So that challenge is gone. In Quebec, it's much more complicated because integration has to occur unless we decide that we don't defend French. We could, but if we do, it creates tensions because we need policies that are seen to be restrictive to be doing that. The tone right now is not particularly conducive to inclusion.
Gareth?
Well, I personally don't see any need or desire to have a kind of strong overarching national identity. I think national identity is inherently exclusionary rather than inclusionary. But what I do think is perhaps along the peace and love direction is that there's a lot of really interesting things going on within neighbourhoods and communities, which is creating, and I'm not comfortable with the concept of integration, but if integration does occur, it's occurring within localities and communities. And that is, I suppose, where I'm hopeful that that peace and love can flourish.
Thanks a lot to all of you for your final very short answers, and to all of the participants this debate. I want to thank Theresia Morandel for her assistance in making this webinar possible, and I wish just to recall that the next webinars of the Autonomy 50 series is on the 9th of November on autonomy and social and health systems, and the end of November on autonomy and political parties. So I hope you enjoy the discussion of today. Thank again to all, and goodbye. Thanks a lot.
Grazie
Bye.
a tutti. Thanks
Grazie.
everybody. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye everybody.